Security is one of the essential aspects of business web applications and needs to be considered by every Jmix developer. Jmix Security is based on the Spring Security Framework. Jmix Security is designed to be flexible and can be integrated with other existing Spring modules that provide alternative authentication mechanisms. In this introductory video, we'll focus on the standard Jmix Security implementation, which is included in new projects by default. The two fundamental security features are called authentication and authorization. Authentication is the process of validating that users are who they claim to be. This can be accomplished, for example, by requiring the user to provide a username and a password when logging into the application. Authorization is the process of giving the user permissions to access specific resources and functions. For example, giving someone the permission to download a particular document on a server. Jmix provides out-of-the-box solutions for both authentication and authorization. Standard Jmix security includes User Entity and User Management UI, Standard Login Screen, CurrentAuthentication, an API to get information about the user who is currently authenticated. Roles and policies allow developers to limit access to the data and the UI elements, screens, and menu items. Practical examples in this video will be based on the specific branch of the Quick Start sample project. You can find its code on GitHub. Check the link in the video description. User is the central object in the security subsystem. It impersonates the subject who is accessing the Jmix system. The user entity is created in the source code of all Jmix projects. This entity implements the User Details interface from the Spring Security Framework, allowing Jmix application to integrate smoothly with the Spring security mechanisms and modules. The newly created Jmix project also contains user management screens, user browser, and user editor. These screens provide the basic functionality of displaying the list of existing users, creating and editing users, changing user passwords, and assigning roles. The newly created Jmix project also contains Liquid-based changelog files that help to initialize the database schema. The init user XML file contains change sets to create the initial structure of the user table. To log into the application during development, we use admin credentials. This change log file contains the change set to create the admin user and assign full access rights to it. The user entity, as well as user screens, can be customized to fulfill specific requirements of your project. Let's add an additional field to the user, address. With the help of Studio, we can also quickly add a new attribute to the user browser and editor screens. Let's restart the application to see how the new user attributes are displayed and edited in the UI. Thus, the user entity and its UI can be customized pretty easily for the purposes of your project. Before entering the UI of the Jmix application, a user has to authenticate using the login screen. Jmix projects contain a standard implementation of the login screen. It requires a user to specify a username and a password in order to authenticate. The login screen can be customized according to the project requirements. To view the code, open the login screen XML file for editing. Let's add some additional content to the screen. We'll add a logo image near the welcome label. The image file has already been put to the Resources folder of the project. Drop the image component from the palette to the screen layout just before the welcome label. Specify the required attributes for the image component. After that, specify the location of the image file. Log into the application and log back out. The changes to the screen have been applied. and the logo has appeared on the screen. In the business logic of the applications, it's often needed to know which user is currently authenticated. Jmix provides this information with the CurrentAuthentication Spring Bean. Let's consider the usage of this API in the practical example. In the data model of our project management sample application, each project has a link to its manager, the field of the user entity class. To speed up form filling, it would be great if the manager field for new products was filled automatically by the current user who is creating this project. Let's implement this behavior. First, navigate to the controller of the project editor screen. Invoke the Generate Handler action and create a handler for the init entity event. This event is dedicated to initialize default values for new entities in the editor screen. Inject the CurrentAuthentication bean to the controller. Call the getUser method and set its return value to the manager entity attribute. As you can see, the IDE complains about incompatible types. We can safely cast the return value to the user class from our project. Switch to the running application and start creation of the new project again. As you can see, the manager field is initialized with the current user. As it's been said already, the authorization is the process of giving the user permissions to access specific resources. Limiting access to resources is the purpose of Jmix Resources roles. The resource role is a named object combining a set of policies that grant users access to various resources in a Jmix application. As Jmix is focused on building data-centric applications with rich user interface, Jmix Resources roles are mainly focused on limiting access to the data and to the elements of UI. Entity policies determine which CRUD operations on an entity are available for the user. Entity attribute policies specify which attributes of each entity are permitted to be viewed or modified by the user. Screen policies and menu policies determine which UI screens and which menu items can be opened by the user. There are also special group-specific policies. They define named permissions on arbitrary functionality and can be used by the developer anywhere in the business logic. What are the main rules of applying the policies in the resource role? First, all resources are denied by default. In order to access a resource, a user needs to be assigned with a role that permits this resource. Second, all policies are positive. It means that with a resource role, you cannot remove some permission that a user already has. You can only add it. And thirdly, a user can have several roles assigned, and all permissions defined by the assigned roles are added together. Jmix provides two ways of defining roles. A role can be defined in the source code of the project in the declarative format of the interface marked with specific annotations. Another way to define a role is to create it in the runtime using Resource Role Editor. Such roles are stored in the database. To demonstrate a practical example of creating a resource role, let's consider the following technical task for our project management sample project. There are two groups of users in the system, administrators and managers. Administrators have unlimited access to the system and all its resources. Managers are limited with what they can do. A manager should be able to open users, projects, tasks, and documents screens. Projects, tasks, and documents can be created, updated, and edited without restrictions. However, when working with users, a manager should be able to only edit first name, last name, and email attributes of existing users without the ability to create or remove them. The address attribute should be hidden from managers. Let's see how we can create resource roles that fulfill these requirements. Regarding administrative permissions, any Jmix project already defines the full access role in the source code. This role gives a user unlimited access to the system. We just need to assign it to the corresponding users in the running application. Let's create a new user named Laura and make it an administrator. To assign a role to the user, use the Role Assignments button in the User Browser screen. Re-log in as Laura. As we can see, all menus, screens, and functionality are available. To create the definition of the manager's resource role, we'll use the visual designer provided by the Studio. Use the plus role action in the action bar of the Jmix tool window. Name the role as Project Management. First, we need to specify data access permissions in the Entities tab. For every entity the role should have access to, we need to specify the allowed CRUD operations as well as attribute permissions. By clicking Allow All, we'll enable all CRUD operations and modification of all attributes for the project, document, and task entities. Then, enable the restricted permissions for the user entity. Only read and update operations are available. Most user attributes should be permitted for viewing, except first name, last name, and email, which should be available for modification, and address, which should be hidden. Please note that in case you need to set up permissions for any entity inherited from the Jmix or one of the add-ons, you'll have to enable the corresponding option in the Settings menu. Next, switch to the Back-Office UI tab to specify which menus and screens should be accessible for this role. Upper nodes of the Screens tree reflect the structure of the application menu. The Other Screens bottom section contains screens not associated with any menu item. Let's enable User, Project, Task, and Project Document browsers. Note that any of these items could be enabled only for opening as a screen. In this case, the permitted screen would be available for opening from other screens, but not as a menu item. Let's restart the application and test this role in action. We can see that the project management role is displayed in the list of resource roles. Now we need to assign the role to a user. To view and change the assigned user roles, click the Role Assignments button in the user browser. Add the project management role to the Resource Permissions table for the Alex user. After that, add one more role, UI Minimal Access. This is a predefined role that grants a user the permission to log into the UI. Then, save changes. Let's re-log in as the Alex user and note that the password is the same as login for this user. Then, check that the requested functionality is available. We can see that menu items are available. However, if you try to create a new project or task, you'll get an error message saying that access is denied. It seems that we forgot to assign permissions to some screens. To find out which screens we forgot to enable in the role permissions, we should look into the log of the Jmix application's run configuration. The error message in the log specifies that the name of the forbidden screen is project.edit. Okay, it looks like we need to permit all editor screens in order to use them in the application. Let's return to the Role Designer. Use the search field to filter screens in the tree by name. Screens we need are listed in the Other Screens section. Allow Document Edit, Project Edit, Task Edit, and User Edit screens. Restart the application to see the changes. All screens are now functional. Now let's check that the manager's access to users is limited. Here you can see that the standard table actions like Create, Edit, and Remove take into account entity CRUD permissions. If the corresponding operation isn't permitted, then the action is automatically disabled. In our case, the manager can't create or remove users. Now check the Per Attribute permissions. After opening the editor screen, we see that the only attributes available for editing are first name, last name, and email. So, data fields in the editor screen take into account attribute permissions. If a user doesn't have the Modify permission for the attribute, the corresponding field in the UI is automatically put into read-only mode. And what about the address field? It's been completely hidden from both user management screens. The table column was hidden, as well as the form field in the editor, according to the attribute access level that we've specified earlier for this attribute. The resource role configuration for our training task is complete. We've observed that the resources roles are deeply integrated into Jmix UI. Note that resource roles can also be created in the runtime by using the Resource Roles screen. In this video, we've discussed the basics of the Jmix security subsystem. Thank you for watching.